officials have said that this won't go Ukraine's actions, hitting one of their ships and killing a crew member and injuring 3 others in a drone strike, won't go unanswered. And in the past, when Iran has given this sort of message, it generally follows through. Now, the Iranians are saying that this was a vessel coming from a Russian port, Astrakhan, at the northern end of the Caspian Sea, 600 miles further south to Port Bandar Anzali in Iran. And it was just carrying steel. But we've heard from President Zelensky, who said, on the contrary, this was an Iranian shipment of weapons to Russia, and that's why they targeted it. They targeted in the Caspian Sea over the past about 8 months or so. But it's been very well clearly documented that Iran, almost since Russia's war began in Ukraine over 4 years ago, that Russia has been relying on Iranian-made drones and weapons support in that war. And for President Zelensky, that makes it a valid target. So there's contrary messages. But if the Iranians say they're going to strike back, that speaks to a further potential expansion of the war fronts here. The whole issue, the whole tensions over the Strait of Hormuz, over Iran's nuclear weapons, over its proxies like the Houthis, the sort of threat that they have to the region, it is all still very, very much in play. And I think what we're witnessing at the moment is it just bubbling up in different areas, even though the main protagonists are on a pause.
All right, Nick Robertson for us. All right, turning to U.S. military operations in Iran, which appear to be on hold amid signs that the war could expand on a new front. Tehran is now threatening Ukraine after Kyiv attacked an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, the route for much of the country's trade with Russia. Ukraine says it struck ships carrying military cargo from Iran to Russia. Iran also says that it will not allow Washington to determine the timing of the war as the U.S. pauses its airstrikes. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations says President Trump is creating space for negotiations.
What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level.
Meantime, global oil prices are sharply lower amid the pause in the Iran war. CNN's Anna Kupin joins us now from London, and we see how delicate the reaction from traders is to the constant news coming out of the Middle East. As soon as there are signs of perhaps more diplomacy, we see a drop in oil prices. When things turn escalatory, they turn around. Just give us a sense of how traders are analyzing all of this.
Yes, well, you're right. It's really sort of very Groundhog Day at the moment. Just a few days ago, we saw oil above $100 a barrel, that real sort of milestone moment. Now it's down, Brent, the global benchmark, down to just under $90 a barrel there. And there are, there's reasons why this is the case. Clearly, there's been a lull in the fighting, and this is a cause for relief among traders. But there are some more structural reasons as to suggest that we're in a position that's slightly, and I emphasize slightly, more positive than we were just a few weeks ago. Parts of the world have gotten used to lower demand for oil in some cases. And then also, during the time that the Strait of Hormuz was kind of basically open, we got over 200 million barrels of oil out. That's according to Lipo Oil Associates. Now, that covers global supply for around 17 weeks. And so that's good news there. China as well has been drawing down its massive stockpiles. We've had release of oil from strategic oil reserves across many countries. So this has all been happening on the backdrop. These are bright spots, Biana, however, on a backdrop of a real negative situation. And we've seen over the weekend just a trickle of ships get out of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran as well saying that, the majority of those ships are moving through this approved corridor. Iran clearly still has a grip over the Strait of Hormuz. And then also this war has opened up on a second front in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. We've seen Iran-backed Houthi militants claim to have attacked Saudi oil tankers. And this is the only way that Saudi Arabia can get out a big chunk of its oil. So yes, we're seeing, lower demand in some places, countries drawing on stockpiles, but fundamentally the relief that we're seeing today in the market will probably be quite short-lived if we are to see another protracted closure of the Strait of Hormuz, Biana.
Yeah, we're already seeing reports of the Saudi deflecting, shooting down missiles coming from what is thought to be the Houthis right now as well. Anna Kubin, thank you. Well, as the war with Iran drags on, new worries are emerging. During a meeting on Friday with President Trump, sources tell us the vice president, along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised concerns about escalating the war and the strain it's putting on U.S. weapons stockpile that is getting quickly depleted. Meanwhile, the Pentagon is revising its casualty numbers after coming under fire last week for being slow to update. It reports at least 18 U.S. troops have now been killed and more than 600 wounded since the war began February 28th. CNN's Kevin Liptak joins us from the White House with more. So, Kevin, the president seemingly reversing course. It appeared he was gearing up for a major military escalation just a few days ago. And per reporting that CNN has done along with other media outlets, there were a couple of top-level officials who warned him that the stockpiles, in particular interceptors, are running and depleting rather quickly. Just talk about how that may have influenced his ultimate decision.
Yeah, and there were multiple concerns raised in this meeting on Friday that the president convened with his national security team. And in particular, you heard the Vice President J.D. Vance and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both raised their misgivings about a potential escalation in the conflict, which President Trump had been previewing publicly and which he seemed poised to give the go-ahead for heading into the weekend. And Dan Kane in particular did raise some of these concerns about dwindling stockpiles of munitions, and in particular, the air defense interceptors that the U.S. has used over the course of this conflict to intercept ballistic missiles that Iran has been firing towards American positions in the region. And you saw how that ended in tragedy when that base in Jordan was targeted, that led to the deaths of 3 American service members. Now, we have known for quite some time that this is a concern inside the administration. There's one group in Washington, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that has estimated that the U.S. has used 1,500 Patriot interceptors over the course of this conflict, which would leave about 1,000 remaining. And it's an extraordinary number when you consider these costs. The interceptors cost about $4 million a piece, and some of what they're being used to intercept, which is the drones that Iran has been using, only cost about $35,000. And so there's a mismatch there that the military will have to work out. Now, in this briefing, General Kane did say that if the president wanted to execute on one of the options or any of the options he had in front of him for escalating, that the military would be able to do that and would be able to do it successfully. But nonetheless, these questions do remain about the stocks. Now, the administration over the last couple of days has been forcefully denying that there are problems with the stockpiles. What Mike Waltz, you saw earlier, the American ambassador to the UN, said is that the military, quote, has everything that it needs to conduct this campaign as effectively as it needs to be. But he was also saying that anyone leaking information about the stockpiles deserves to go to jail. And I don't think it's a crime to leak false information. And so there is, I think, clearly some concerns bubbling up underneath the surface. There were also in this meeting concerns raised about the potential for civilian deaths inside Iran. And we know that the president has been openly musing about going after civilian infrastructure, also concerns about a potential refugee crisis. And I think perhaps the biggest concern of all, aside from the stockpiles, is that this may not eventually prove effective in getting the Iranians back to the negotiating table, which is what the U.S. wants to see here if the president is to see this war come to an end. And so I think a lot of questions about whether the president has completely ruled this out. He told Axios earlier today that he would pull the trigger on a major escalation if the Iranians don't come back in a meaningful way to the negotiations. And so it still seems as if it's an open question where this is all heading, but the president holding off on that intensification, at least for now.
Yeah, and Axios also reporting that another factor was CENTCOM Commander Bradley Cooper reportedly suggesting a pause in the constant military strikes in the Strait of Hormuz, saying that in his view they've lost their effectiveness at this point as well. Kevin Liptak, thank you so much. For more on this, I want to bring in retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Karen Gibson. General, thank you so much for joining us. So you just heard that whole setup about the reporting over the weekend. The White House is disputing that, saying there's no stockpile issue, and that if the president were wanting to re-engage once again in a massive kinetic strike and campaign, that he has all of the resources and assets that he needs. So which one is it, in your view?
Well, I think both could be true. We could have enough interceptors remaining in the stockpile to wage this war with Iran. But one problem is that these are not just used for this current conflict in the Middle East. This is a weapons system and ammunition that we provide to allies, to Gulf partners across the region, to Ukraine, and to East Asian allies. And the shortfalls within the defense industrial base have been known for years. They long predate this administration and the one before it. And the question has always been posed, do we have enough interceptors in the event something happens and we have to defend Taiwan? So this is a weapon system. Yes, we may have enough for the campaign with Iran, but it's going to take a very long time for the industrial base to restock what's been expended. And that has implications for other theaters as well. So in that sense, both could be accurate.
So then explain to both American audiences, the taxpayers who are footing the bill for the Defense Department and supporting our troops and procurement of these weapons, and for viewers abroad who see that the U.S. defense budget balloons, even the number two after the U.S. in terms of how much resources, how much money is allocated, trillions of dollars to the Defense Department. So how do you answer the question of why then, after just 4 months of not a fully engaged war with troops on the ground as we'd seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, how are we even having this conversation now about stockpiles?
Well, sure. I think it's fair to say that the people who planned the operation did not predict that it would last this long. And certainly they thought that there would probably be a more rapid capitulation on the part of the Islamic regime. There may have been some assumptions that they won't stop traffic in the Strait of Hormuz because that'll impact their economy. They won't attack other states in the Gulf because they need them to remain neutral. And if the economic well-being of the Iranian people was the foremost priority of the Islamic Republic, those might be the decisions they had made. But I think it's easy to forget that for the men who lead the Republic, they see this as an existential fight for their survival, and they are not making decisions on that calculus. Their strategy all along has been to make the conflict so economically and politically untenable for the United States that the U.S. would back off on some of the concessions they are asking. And they've believed that they can sustain both the U.S. Strikes, airstrikes, and sanction regimes, as well as continue to impose these very asymmetric and punishing retaliatory strikes of their own, and that they believe they have more staying power.
So then, if the original assumption proved to have been a miscalculation on the part of those advising the president who ultimately made the decision to start the war, I think most would agree just backing away right now and wiping your hands clean of the war and calling it over is not really an option for the United States and has global ramifications beyond just the Gulf. What options does he have right now to course correct, especially when you hear what Admiral Cooper reportedly said about these constant strikes around targets over the Strait of Hormuz losing their effectiveness?
Sure. So let's look first at Admiral Cooper's comments. You know, when I look at an adversary's options, I look at two things. One, their will, their intent, their desire, and two, the capability to execute that. And in this phase of the campaign, which is no longer about imposing enduring curbs on Iran's nuclear program, but it is really about reopening the strait to global traffic, Iran has made very clear that they intend to control that, to develop some kind of administrative construct that they are in charge of. That's their will and intent. And their ability to do so is these one-way attack drones and sometimes missiles. So while the U.S. military under Admiral Cooper has had tremendous tactical effectiveness, destroying many Iranian military capabilities. They haven't eliminated those entirely. It's a very narrow strait, and Iran has a vast geography from which they can attack it. And actually eliminating all of these mobile, easy to hide, relatively easy to produce drones is an exceptionally high bar. Frankly, eliminating it, probably impossible. And then if you look at the other side, Iran's will and intent, they haven't backed off on that either. And so I think, or at least there's no indication that we've moved the needle in that regard. And I think that's probably what Admiral Cooper was getting at, that more of the same is not going to have the effect of reopening the strait. So I think the administration faces two choices in that case. Three, if you consider you could continue to do more of the same. You could escalate, and Kevin previously highlighted some of the risks associated with that. Or you could pause these strikes and see where we are in terms of potential negotiations with Iran while continuing to sustain the economic blockade, the sanctions regime, and keeping military forces in the region to apply additional pressure if needed. I think that's the dilemma that the administration faces right now.
All right, now to new CNN reporting about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the U.S. war with Iran. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tell CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the war. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences. A U.S. Defense Department source says military operations are currently on hold, but it's unclear if that Friday White House meeting prompted the U.S. to pause what had been nearly 2 weeks of strikes on Iran. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this meeting and the president's plans for the war going forward?
Frederica, President Trump spending part of his Friday with top advisors and cabinet officials discussing the possibility of escalating this war with Iran. But now we are seeing an apparent pause in that fighting after 13 consecutive nights of strikes. One U.S. official saying that military operations are on a hold as we are seeing these diplomatic discussions pick back up after that ceasefire fell apart just a few weeks ago. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz addressing that pause earlier today. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday White House meeting, we are learning, according to our sources, that Vice President J.D. Vance, along with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, both raised concerns about escalating this conflict. The president in the past has threatened massive attacks. That could include critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, Karg Island, which is a key oil hub, along with Pickaxe Mountain, which is believed to be a nuclear site. Now, that could constitute war crimes, potentially. And Kane, in that meeting, specifically raised concerns about U.S. munitions stockpiles. We've heard now from Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell. He says in a statement, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." Now, sources say that other major concerns were raised to the president in that meeting. That includes the possibility of massive civilian casualties in Iran, as well as a potential refugee crisis, as well as this idea that this could spill into a broader regional conflict. But there are few people within President Trump's inner circle that believe that these options for escalation are going to yield the results that President Trump is hoping for. Frederica.
All right, Betsy Klein, keep us posted there from the White House. Thank you. All right, meantime, Iran says it held talks with Oman in Tehran about the Strait of Hormuz over the past 2 days. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated the blockade. At the same time, a new front in the war is opening in the Red Sea, where Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen have exchanged attacks with Saudi Arabia. That conflict threatening another critical oil corridor. CNN's Nick Robertson joins us right now. Nick, we've got this apparent U.S. pause on strikes in Iran. How might that impact peace talks overall?
It gives them an opportunity. We heard from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman today saying that there was progress, that the talks were constructive, that they'd continue at a political and technical level. But it's key to understanding the details, and we just don't have them. The talks were all about the Strait of Hormuz, of course, and the key point here is, do the Iranians finally agree that they give up control of the Strait of Hormuz and allow traffic to pass through, marine traffic, and not try to get any tolls and not tell them which passages and pathways to go down through the Strait of Hormuz? And there's no indication that's about to happen. So it will be the output of that meeting, what the Omanis pass on to the U.S. diplomats, what the White House gets back from those talks is going to determine the next moves. Clearly, the implication we've heard from Ambassador Waltz, from the Pentagon, from the indications from the White House, is this is a sort of unannounced temporary ceasefire type deal to make the space for diplomacy. But it's not clear just because you're talking that there's actually going to be an outcome that's good enough for the White House. I think on the Houthi front in the Red Sea and the trying to stop the Saudi oil getting out to world markets, it's having a chilling effect. But as far as we know today, the Houthis haven't fired any additional missiles at Saudi infrastructure. So perhaps they're aligned with Iran, so perhaps they're taking a beat on all of this at the moment as well. And then, of course, tomorrow, Prime Minister Netanyahu will leave Israel. He'll head to the United States for the funeral of Lindsey Graham, but it also is meeting at the White House with President Trump on Tuesday. We can expect the Israeli Prime Minister to thank the president for announcing that Saudi Arabia has to normalize with Israel before it can have this civilian nuclear deal. But also the key thing there will be, what intelligence does Prime Minister Netanyahu share with President Trump about Iranian nuclear assets? Where are they? Of course, it was the Israelis that had a lot of information about leading towards the Pickaxe Mountain as being a storage facility for some of the highly enriched uranium and other nuclear storage sites that the Iranians have. So what else is Prime Minister Netanyahu going to put on President Trump's desk that then may influence where this war goes next?
All right, very complex. Nick Robertson, thank you so much. All right, let's continue this conversation. With us now is Alireza Nader. He is the president of the Nader Research Group. There is a pause in fighting right now, and Iran is talking with Omanis about the Strait of Hormuz. But I wonder, in your view, what kind of diplomacy talks continue? And with whom? I mean, we heard Mr. Waltz say that even the U.S. at the highest levels is still continuing to be part of the diplomacy talks. But I wonder, with this hold on U.S. military operations, what kind of impact these talks might have.
Thanks for having me. I think both sides really want this conflict to end. The Trump administration realizes that it is stuck in a quagmire, and the economy in Iran is suffering greatly. The regime is under huge pressure, and it wants to get the most out of its discussions with Washington, D.C. So I think the last few days of military action we've seen from the United States and from Iran is really meant to increase each side's leverage so they can get a better deal out of these upcoming negotiations. Oman has been a mediator between the two sides. It has very good relations with Iran, and will continue to play a big role, I think, in future negotiations.
And then you have stated that, U.S. attacks on civilian infrastructure inside Iran is actually strengthening the regime. Why do you believe that is the case? How do you know that is the case?
Look, before this war started in January, there were huge peaceful protests against the regime, really a revolutionary movement in Iran that was disrupted by this war. Right now, the U.S. is conducting lots of attacks against military facilities in Iran, but civilians are getting hit very hard as well. I'm very concerned about the U.S.-Israeli strategy of destroying Iran's critical water and energy infrastructure because Iran is on the brink of economic and environmental collapse. And the U.S. destroying these facilities is not going to hurt the regime. It's going to hurt ordinary people. Most of the regime's military assets and its senior leadership and Iran's political leadership is underground. They're pretty safe from these bombs, but the people above ground are getting hurt and killed.
How do you think specifically civilians in Iran are being impacted? Because obviously, pictures are not coming out, nor is the sentiment of a lot of Iranian civilians. So, can you paint a picture for us, of how life in general is being impacted there in Tehran and in the outskirts as well?
I think life in Iran is hell. Unless you're connected to the regime, life is hell because the people in Iran, and we hear this a lot from the reporting we're getting from within Iran. A lot of people expected that the Trump administration would come to their help after thousands of Iranians were massacred by the regime. That help really never came. The regime is still in power. It is executing innocent people left and right. And this war has demonstrated, I think, the weakness of U.S. military power. And I hope really for once and all, American policymakers and the public realize that you can't overthrow the regime in Iran through war, through bombs from the air. The people of Iran have to create that change for themselves, and they can't do that while they're being bombed.
All right, we begin this hour with new developments in the U.S. war with Iran. Today, a U.S. source tells CNN that military operations with Iran are currently on a hold. And it comes as we are learning new details about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the war. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tells CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the war. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences of ramping up the war. Since that meeting, the U.S. has paused nearly 2 weeks of strikes on Iran, but it's unclear if those warnings prompted the lull in the attacks. We've got a team of correspondents around the globe covering these developments. Nick Robertson is in Jerusalem, but let's begin with Betsy Klein at the White House. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this White House meeting?
That's right, Frederica. President Trump spending part of his Friday huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss the options for an escalation in this 5-month-long war with Iran. But for the last 2 nights, we have seen this apparent pause in fighting after 13 consecutive days of U.S. strikes on Iran. One U.S. source telling CNN that those attacks are on a hold as they give the diplomatic discussions some time to play out. We heard moments ago from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, weighing in on that pause. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday meeting, we are learning that both Vice President J.D. Vance and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane raised concerns to the president about the possibility of that escalation. The president, for weeks, has been threatening massive attacks on Iran. That could impact critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, as well as the key oil hub of Karg Island. The president has been warned that that could constitute war crimes. Kane also specifically raised concerns about U.S. munitions stockpiles. But we heard from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell addressing that. He says, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." But sources say that other concerns were raised to Trump, including the possibility of massive civilian casualties across Iran, the idea of a potential refugee crisis, as well as this conflict potentially spilling into a broader war across the Middle East. Now, there are few people, we are learning, within the president's inner circle who believe that the options he has been given for this escalation would yield the results that he is hoping for, Frederica, as he weighs that path forward.
All right, Betsy Klein at the White House, thanks so much. All right, let's go to Nick Robertson now. Nick, do we know how this apparent U.S. pause on strikes with Iran may be impacting peace talks?
Yeah, it's certainly given them the space. So the Omanis had a delegation in Tehran on Friday. They stayed there through Saturday. They left late Saturday. They were talking about the Strait of Hormuz. We heard today from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman who said the talks were constructive, that progress was made, that they would continue at a technical and political level. So you can hear right there that the language kind of matches what we're getting from the White House. But the key details we're not getting, right? And the key detail is, have the Iranians agreed not to try to charge tolls on the Strait of Hormuz, which is the main issue in play right now. Both countries have got their blockades ongoing at the moment, but the main hostilities are sort of abated. Perhaps President Trump will get more insights from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he leaves here tomorrow, heads to Washington for the funeral of Lindsey Graham, but he'll meet President Trump at the White House on Tuesday. He's very likely to give the president an update on the latest intelligence that the Israelis have. And of course, they've had intelligence that's pointed towards Pickaxe Mountain in Iran as a site where Iran may have tried to secure some of its highly enriched uranium and other centrifuges and other equipment that it uses to enrich uranium. So there may well be new information put in front of the president by the Israeli Prime Minister, who is keen, perhaps, let's not say for the war to continue, but the war pausing the way it has caused him political hardship at home. And he's got elections coming up in 3 months, so he'll be minded to try to find a way to persuade President Trump that there is still work to be done on Iran and perhaps present a roadmap for that. He'll also likely thank President Trump for putting a sort of a speed bump in the path of Saudi Arabia's civilian nuclear deal with the United States by saying that Saudi must normalize with Israel before that can go ahead. That's something the Israeli Prime Minister is grateful for. Big picture, did those talks give the product the president wants? That's the space we're in right now.
This morning, CNN has new reporting about a key meeting related to the U.S. war with Iran. A source and U.S. officials say that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned President Trump about potential consequences if he escalates the war. According to those sources, Kane expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative effects. Now, it's unclear if that's why the U.S. decided to suspend nearly 2 weeks of attacks against Iran. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is with us now. Nick, it's all happening ahead of that meeting between President Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, their first since the start face-to-face in this war.
Yeah, and it's going to be an important one because Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been happy with the ceasefire that was put in place several months ago, and it's not clear where he stands on the current pause that's underway at the moment. He was speaking to the government this morning. He said that he'd be leaving for Washington tomorrow and that he would be meeting with President Trump on Tuesday, that all pending issues were going to be discussed, including Iran. So I think everyone here imagines that's pretty pretty much going to be front and center. We've watched Omani diplomacy over the last couple of days. They took a trip, sent a delegation to Tehran. They got there Friday, left Saturday. The conversation was about the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, what the United States wants to see is Iran relinquish its desire and commitment to having some kind of payment method, some kind of continued control over ships coming and going from the Strait of Hormuz. It's not clear if the Omanis made any headway there, but it perhaps was this sort of pause has allowed that diplomacy to happen. So the question is, how will the president view the outcome of the conversations the Omanis had? But as you say, the United States continuing its blockade, the Iranians doing the same, saying that they've stopped 6 ships from going into the Strait of Hormuz, not by fire, but they're saying those ships have been now put at anchor. But the U.S. Central Command saying that they have told 12 ships and stopped 12 ships from passing through the Strait of Hormuz over the last few days during the current bout of conflict. So where it goes from here, this really does seem to be a matter of whether diplomacy has been able to take advantage of this pause.
Developments in the war with Iran. Today, a U.S. source tells CNN military operations with Iran are currently on a hold. That pause comes as we are learning new details about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the war. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tells CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the conflict. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options. But he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative implications of ramping up the war. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now from the White House. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this meeting?
Right, Frederica, this could go down as one of the more consequential meetings of this 5-month-long conflict with Iran now. But President Trump huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials on Friday to discuss options for an escalation in this war with Iran. But after that meeting, 2 consecutive nights without strikes after 13 days of attacks. Now, one U.S. source says that military operations are on a hold as they give the diplomatic discussions some time to play out. We heard earlier today from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, addressing that pause. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks, some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday meeting, 2 sources say that both Vice President J.D. Vance and U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane raised concerns about the possibility of an escalation. And we've heard President Trump telegraph the possibility of massive attacks for weeks now. That could be attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, as well as that key oil hub of Karg Island. And doing so, some have warned, could constitute war crimes. But one of the other concerns that Kane raised during that meeting, according to one of the sources, was the U.S. munitions stockpile. We heard from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell. He says in a statement, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." Now, sources say that in that same meeting, other concerns were raised to the president, including the possibility of massive civilian casualties in Iran, the concerns about a refugee crisis potentially, as well as this conflict spilling into a broader regional conflict. Now, there are few people at this point in the president's inner circle that believe that the escalation options the president has been presented are going to yield the results that he is hoping for. So he's plotting a path forward with all this information. We'll wait to see what happens tonight, Frederica.
Keeping them honest tonight, has the Trump administration just gone eyeball to eyeball with Iran and blinked? That is the question, and here's why it is. 2 weeks ago today, the president declared the U.S. the guardian of the Strait of Hormuz, and a day later said, quote, "Oil is flowing like never before thanks to the awesome power of the United States military." It wasn't then, and it isn't now. 12 days ago, he was warning that right about now, American forces would be in the middle of leveling Iran's civilian infrastructure.
Next week, it gets really bad for them. We're going to knock out all their power plants. We're going to knock out all their bridges unless they get to the table and negotiate.
So tonight, instead of that, whatever you might think of it, there are no airstrikes. The strait is still effectively closed. Oil is still not flowing, and Iran has conceded nothing. In fact, it seems that nothing has materially changed from 2 weeks ago when the last round of airstrikes were getting underway. So why have they stopped, and why is the president now saying this?
They asked us very nicely, please stop. Let's meet. And that's what we are right now. We'll see what happens. If we don't make a deal, we go back to the same thing.
Now, this would be a hopeful sign. Yet today, Iran's foreign ministry says no, that is not happening. There are no talks underway. Now, it is always possible he's just saying that for public consumption, or that the president is referring to the initiative that Oman's foreign minister has launched with counterparts from the region, including Iran. But for now, we have no evidence or indication that direct talks are back on again, let alone that Iran, as the president said, asked us very nicely, please stop, let's meet. On the other hand, there is evidence of another reason for stopping the air campaign. It has to do with the shrinking U.S. inventory of munitions after nearly 5 months of war, something UN Ambassador Mike Waltz signaled over the weekend, ironically, with this very precise denial.
I want to be crystal clear. The U.S. military, and I've verified this every which way, has everything that it needs to conduct this campaign as effectively as it needs to be. And I have to tell you, the people that are leaking this nonsense deserve to be in jail.
So notice he said the military has, quote, everything it needs to conduct this campaign. That is also what a source tells us that Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane told the president on Friday. It is true as far as it goes. The real concern appears to be that the war would leave the military short of what it needs to handle future conflicts or supply allies should they ask for help, something multiple sources tell us that General Kane himself warned the president about before the war even began. And a recent study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies shows the problem. As of May, CSIS estimates that as many as 1,430 Patriot air defense missiles had been fired, along with more than 1,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles, and that it will take well into 2029 or as long as 2031 to restock them to pre-war levels. The president himself suggested as much today while blaming his predecessor for it, not the war.
And we're in very good shape. But for some of the more sophisticated stuff, we'd certainly like to have more. Biden gave a lot of it away.
So clearly the president is aware there is a finite stockpile to deal with. Less clear the extent to which this factored into pausing the strikes. But it was not the only concern raised with the president on Friday, according to a source familiar with the discussion. That also included causing a refugee crisis, Iranian retaliation against Gulf energy and desalination targets, and sparking a greater regional war. All possible reasons to stop and think, or even to stop and blink. With us now, retired Army Lieutenant General Karen Gibson. She's the former Director of Intelligence for U.S. Central Command. Also former senior U.S. diplomat Alan Ayer, who was a key member of the team that negotiated the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. General Gibson, I want to start with you. You heard the president's threats in the days leading up to his decision to pause these strikes. Did Iran, in essence, call his bluff?
Well, it's a good question, John, and I'm not sure we'll know exactly how or why the president made the decision he did. I think he had three options. One, to stay the course, which was returning limited return on investment strategically. At the tactical level, U.S. Central Command is doing a very good job of destroying Iranian military capabilities, but not enough to eliminate the threat to the strait. It's a very small area that we're trying to defend, and Iran has a vast geography from which they can attack it with relatively easy to produce, low cost, easy to hide one-way attack drones. So entirely eliminating that threat is very, very difficult. And I think also, if if we look at Iran's will and intent, there's not any evidence that we had moved the needle on their desire, their insistence to continue to control traffic through the Strait. So perhaps a very limited return on investment to keep doing what you've been doing. His other two options were to escalate, and I think you've done a great job of highlighting some of the risks associated with that, not only the diminishment of our stocks of very expensive interceptors, but also the potential for broad retaliation, alienating Gulf partners, and again, perhaps not getting what we want. And then a third course of action where he could pause, assess, see where we're at in terms of an ability to have a discussion, a productive discussion with Iran going forward. And clearly that is the choice that he's made.
Yeah, Alan, let's continue with option number 3 there that the general has just laid out. The president claimed that Iran, quote, asked us very nicely, please stop, let's meet. And for its part, Iran's foreign ministry says it's not currently engaged in peace talks with the United States. What do you think the potential for negotiations is today?
I think, John, the potential for negotiation is pretty good, but the U.S. isn't a part of it. I think what's happening now, the area that has the most promise is Iran talking to Oman. Because don't forget, in Article 5 of the now shredded MOU, it said that Oman and the Iran, and with Oman consulting with the relevant coastal countries, will determine the future of the Strait. So the U.S. is incapable or unwilling to do the sort of diplomacy we need to get out of this mess. But if Oman is talking to Iran, there's a chance that together they can come up with some type of system for administrative control of the Strait that will please all parties concerned. But at this point, I hope the U.S. is just letting that happen without trying to interfere.
And of course, that would, in essence, leave Iran in control of the Strait, or at least have more control of the Strait than they did before this conflict began.
But as the general said, we can't avoid that. That's a given.
Yeah, which is a statement in and of itself at this point. General, you mentioned the concerns, or we talked about the concerns of the U.S. munitions stockpile. How big of an issue do you think that is?
Well, I think any time that you are expending munitions at a rate faster than the defense industrial base can reconstitute them, you're going to diminish your supplies. And that always happens in combat because we use them much faster than they are produced. The shortfall with munitions nationally has been an issue for many years. It predates this administration and the one before it, and in fact is one of the 4 priorities that the Trump administration laid out in their new national defense strategy to rebuild that defense industrial base. And as you talked about earlier in this segment, it's not just the munitions we would want for this campaign against Iran. Frankly, when we used to look at shortcomings for munitions, it was always in the context of, would we have enough in case we had to defend Taiwan? And these are munitions that are used by our Gulf partners. They are used in Ukraine. They've been used by East Asian allies. And so there's great demand for them. And expending them in the campaign against Iran certainly limits options for potential conflict in every other theater of war.
Yeah, be sure China and Russia are watching very closely. Alan, just to put a little more meat on what we were just talking about. 78 vessels were observed transiting the Strait of Hormuz since Saturday. 20 were Iranian flagged, 58 from other countries, and almost all of them used the route designated by Iran. None were recorded using the southern route near the coast of Oman that the U.S. wants them to take. So this is all, by the way, according to the shipping intelligence group Maersk. What does this tell you? Does this tell you that Iran continues to get what it wants in the Strait?
I think to an extent, yes, because Iran, if the U.S. tries to get more ships through the southern route, the Omani coast, Iran will attack again and will get a recrudescence, a reignition of what happened last time.
Out front tonight, Trump gaslighting on Iran. So the last 4 Americans killed in the war in Iran are not listed as being killed in the war. They're not listed under Operation Epic Fury, which is Trump's formal description of the war in Iran. They are instead listed in an entirely new category. That category you can see with its own webpage called Overseas Operations, which is quite vague and obviously could be anything. And in fact, these are the only 4 Americans listed on this page as dead. There are 207 wounded in action also there. Now, because the Operation Epic Fury, or the Iran war, is still ongoing, deaths in the Middle East because of the war were put in that category. originally the 4 troops were actually put in that category. But then on Thursday, they were taken out. They just vanished completely from the website. They were nowhere. The spokesperson for the Defense Department, Sean Parnell, tweeted at 1:39 a.m. on Friday, the Department of War is aware of temporary data disruptions on the Defense Casualty Analysis System, DCAS website. These site anomalies are currently being resolved in coordination with the military services. So when you talk about it as a temporary data disruption, I mean, you're saying it's a mistake. We're fixing it. Except for it wasn't. They didn't put them back in Operation Epic Fury. They're still not there. I spoke to the wife of one of those 4 fallen soldiers, Sergeant Michael Swinton. Mia Swinton talked about her husband's removal from the official death toll for Operation Epic Fury. Has anyone spoken to you about this or told you anything about it?
Nobody has reached out yet. Wow. I kind of don't have words for that.
There are no words for it. Why would the administration start putting deaths from the Iran war into a whole new webpage called Overseas Operations? The families of the 4 Americans who just died deserve answers about that. Their loved ones died as a result of the war with Iran, a war that is still claiming American lives and is still going through nearly daily bombing campaigns. Now tonight, Trump is once again saying a deal to end the war, though, is near.
Right now, they're talking to us about making a deal. Right now, they have very friendly negotiations going on. Now they're behaving again. You know, it's like playing a banjo.
Now, there's a lot of rhetoric here, and the rhetoric on the other side is obviously diametrically different. A spokesperson for Iran's foreign minister hours ago said there are, quote, no negotiations with the United States at present, and on state media, there were more violent threats against President Trump today. But even as the Strait of Hormuz is still under Iranian de facto control, Trump is continuing to push his own propaganda on the situation. Just look at the slew of AI-generated images he's posted over the past day and a half. Guardians of the world, you can see there suggesting the United States is in charge of the Strait of Hormuz, our oil tanker, and then showing Iran in flames, in total flames, which is very jarring when you consider who usually puts out this type of propaganda. Several years ago, Iran posted this video of the United States Capitol being blown up. North Korea posted a video of the United States with a nuclear bomb dropping on it. That's usually where those kinds of videos of countries in flames come from. They don't usually come from the President of the United States. Kristen Holmes is out front live outside the White House. And Kristen, there appears to be a lack of transparency when it comes to troop deaths in this war. And there's obviously a lack of transparency in many other areas as well. U.S. weapons stockpiles, missile defense. The list goes on and on. What are you learning?
Yeah, the munitions stockpile right now is the big question. We know from our reporting that General Dan Kane was in a meeting with President Trump. He was one of a few officials who back to the munitions stockpile. And the narrative from the White House has been all over the place when it comes to what's actually going on with the stockpile. You have on one hand this kind of desperate plea for more money, saying that the Biden administration depleted all of the munitions stockpile, that they need more money to actually rebuild that up. But then on the other hand, you have President Trump saying there's plenty. He'd like more, but of course there's plenty. They can do whatever they want. They have everything that they need. That in itself is a lack of transparency. And Aaron, this really goes back to the beginning of this entire war, which is why the United States chose to get involved in that moment. And one of the ongoing problems that the United States and Americans have had with this war is why exactly are Americans involved in this in the first place? And it's been a hard question for this administration to answer specifically. And I do want to just note, I'm not sure if you can hear it, it's loud on my end, but the sirens going off. We know that that's around the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has just landed in Washington. He is staying at the Blair House across the street from the White House here. He is scheduled to meet with President Trump tomorrow. And one of the interesting things about that is, as we're talking about this stockpile and munitions and whether or not it is depleted, Netanyahu is the one who really wanted President Trump to get involved in this war. And it's likely he's going to bring that to the table again and argue that President Trump has more unfinished business. But I will tell you from talking to these White House officials officials, from you talking to U.S. officials, there's so little appetite for any kind of escalation on the military angle of this. But Aaron, what is next and where does this go? We have been in this exact position before where President Trump walks it to the brink and then says, actually, negotiations are ongoing, they're going to happen. What the next step is, I mean, that's what we're watching to see how it plays out right now.
All right, Kristen, thank you very much. And I want to go now to retired U.S. Army Major General Randy Manner. And General, let me just ask you, we have known about a diminishment in stockpiles for actually quite some time, right? We've known this is an issue. We knew in the early days of the war, as the reporting came out, but that all but one of the U.S. THAAD missile defense systems in the region were taken out. And we saw evidence of that when military bases, radar installations, planes were hit with precision strikes. But now even more detail on the diminishing munitions and the stockpiles. How worried are you about that?
I'm very worried about our stockpiles. And I'm very worried about, quite frankly, the sanity of the Secretary of Defense.
We have more breaking news this evening. The U.S. military said it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea today as part of its blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command says that the naval blockade against Iran remains in full effect. Now, it all comes even as, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, neither the U.S. nor Iran seem to carry out serious attacks overnight. But the apparent pause in strikes does not mean the conflict is any less fraught, as a new front is emerging in the war, this time in the Red Sea. This morning, Iranian-backed rebel group the Houthis attacking Saudi Arabian targets on the coast. CNN senior White House reporter Betsy Klein joins us now. Betsy, what's the latest here?
Well, Danny, the short answer is we just don't know how much to read into what appears to be a pause in strikes in Iran. A relatively quiet night last night after 13 consecutive nights of U.S. launched strikes. But this comes after U.S. intelligence agencies had assessed in recent days that the types of limited strikes that the U.S. had been carrying out were unlikely to shift Iran's negotiation position. President Trump, in his view, does not believe that Iran is ready yet to come to the table and negotiate in a meaningful way. He also offered some view into his headspace yesterday. Listen.
Look, we're talking to them right now. I think they're getting more and more serious as the days go by, for maybe the obvious reason. But we are talking to them right now. Look, there are two ways. I consider that the smarter way, but the other is probably the easier way, doing what we're doing. And we can take that to a much higher level if we want to. You know, we're prepared to do that, as you know. We're locked and loaded.
Now, just about 5 months into this war, the president has limited options. He can pursue that diplomatic path, which after that ceasefire and memorandum of understanding have totally broken down, have really proven to not yet be successful. He can maintain the status quo, these limited strikes, as I mentioned earlier, or he can escalate. The president has previewed the possibility of really ramping up with attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, Karg Island, that key oil hub, as well as the possibility of strikes on Pickaxe Mountain, which is believed to be an Iranian nuclear set. But as we are trying to ascertain what exactly to make of this apparent pause in strikes, a senior U.S. official telling me, quote, President Trump has always been clear that his preference is diplomacy, but he has shown Iran what will happen if they fail to come to the table in a serious way. The clear question right now is whether whether President Trump believes that that bar is being met for some serious diplomacy going forward. But this is clearly a moment of extreme political pressure on the president. Public opinion shows that this war is deeply unpopular with the American people. Gas prices ticking up to $4.11 a gallon, according to AAA on average. And the midterms are now just 3 months away. So all of that weighing on President Trump as he plots a path forward, Danny.
Yeah, weighing on the president indeed. All right, Betsy Klein, thank you so much for that reporting as always. Appreciate it. And we're joined now by retired U.S. Army Major General Randy Manner. He served as the Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Third Army in Kuwait. General, good to have you here this evening. From a military perspective, what does it signal to you that there were no reported strikes from either side really overnight?
Well, it's always good that hopefully there's a de-escalation. That's always good for both sides. The other side of the coin is that is also a precursor to perhaps preparing for much larger strikes to come. So I think in addition to what was said by the previous reporter, it is very likely because the status quo attacks the United States has been doing have had minimal to no impact on shifting the Iranian position and getting them to the bargaining table.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because for almost 2 weeks straight, right, the U.S. conducted nightly strikes against Iran. What do you see, if anything, was achieved during that period? Because, I mean, I guess if it resulted in this de-escalation, that's one thing, but it doesn't seem like much came of that, no?
It was a complete waste of armaments, a complete waste of lives on both sides. And the result is that we now, it's been verified and validated by the Iranians that our president, unfortunately, is a paper tiger. He threatens constantly, but the reality is he has been unsuccessful in bringing the Iranians to the table. Quite frankly, I think the president's desperate to get back to the day before he started this war, and would he'd be very happy with having the strait reopened. Remember, by his own words, he said that we've destroyed the Iranians' capability to enrich uranium. Twice he has said this already.
For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, neither country seemed to exchange strikes overnight. But the U.S. and Iran are still at odds and contradicting one another about the current state of talks. Plus, in the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. military says it boarded a tanker today as part of its blockade of Iranian ports. And the conflict is still at risk of widening, with a new front emerging in the Red Sea. This morning, the Iran-backed Houthis struck Saudi Arabian targets on the coast there. For more on all of this, CNN senior White House reporter Betsy Klein joins us now. Betsy, tell us, what's the latest you're hearing from the administration about this war?
Well, Danny, we know that President Trump spent part of his Friday huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss the possibility of an escalation in his war with Iran. But then Friday night into Saturday, a relatively quiet night with an apparent pause in that fighting after 13 consecutive nights of strikes. It's not clear at this point how much we should be reading into that pause, but it comes after the U.S. intelligence community had assessed that the strikes that the U.S. had been carrying out on Iran were unlikely to shift Iran's negotiation position, according to two sources familiar with the matter. Now, President Trump has said that he does not believe that Iran is ready to come to the negotiation table. He has also been threatening massive attacks, but he offered some vision into his headspace yesterday. Listen.
Look, we're talking to them right now. I think they're getting more and more serious as the days go by, for maybe the obvious reason. But we are talking to them right now. Look, there are two ways. I consider that the smarter way, but the other is probably the easier way, doing what we're doing. And we can take that to a much higher level if we want to. You know, we're prepared to do that, as you know. We're locked and loaded.
Now, as the president weighs a path forward, he really has limited options here. He can pursue that path of diplomacy, which has not yet been successful after that memorandum of understanding and ceasefire fell apart in recent weeks. He could continue the status quo of these limited strikes, or he could escalate. And he has threatened attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, that key oil hub of Karg Island, as well as possibilities of strikes on Pickaxe Mountain, which is believed to be an Iranian nuclear site. Now, we're trying to ascertain what to make of this pause in strikes. I asked the White House what their view is. I spoke with a senior official who said, quote, President Trump has always been clear that his preference is diplomacy, but he has shown Iran what will happen if they fail to come to the table in a serious way. The key question now is whether the Trump administration believes that that bar is being met, Danny.
All right, Betsy Klein, thank you so much for the latest on that situation. For more on this, we're joined now by Democratic Representative Greg Stanton of Arizona. He serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to begin with the latest on Iran. Do you see a window of opportunity for negotiations in this apparent pause in strikes?
Any opportunity the president might have to get to a negotiated solution is the right step. But remember, while they may be temporarily pausing the attacks on Iran now, the Iranian proxy, the Houthis, were able to successfully strike an oil refinery in Saudi Arabia, thereby continuing to expand this war, the theater of this war. So it is critically important that we end this war as soon as possible.
Congressman, U.S. Central Command is saying that it boarded a tanker today as part of its larger blockade of Iranian ports. How long, from your perspective, can the U.S. keep up this blockade?
Look, when we left Washington, D.C. on Thursday, we voted over $70 billion more for this war. No Democrats supported it. It was the Republicans that completely, without question, gave so many more dollars to continue to fight this war. It's completely unacceptable. We've lost 18 soldiers. And now the Houthis, I mentioned the strike on the oil refinery Saudi, are also threatening to shut down the Red Sea for oil tankers as well. Look, the intelligence community told the president all of these things were virtually inevitable if he engaged in this war of choice. The president chose to ignore him. He pretended like none of this was foreseeable. All of it was foreseeable. His decision-making has been some of the worst that we have seen by a president during a wartime.
It comes as Trump appears fixated on striking Pickaxe Mountain, a suspected nuclear site.
Do you believe that Iran has moved nuclear centrifuges into Pickaxe Mountain?
Well, that's where the action is, and we'll be hitting that area probably pretty soon. And there's not a thing they can do about it. Normally I wouldn't say that. If I thought they could do something about it, I would never say that. But we'll be hitting that area pretty soon, and very heavily.
This sudden focus on Pickaxe Mountain, which is the English translation of the Persian word, raises serious questions. Trump says Pickaxe is, quote, where the action is. Well, if that is the case, what happened to this repeated assertion after the U.S. attacked Iran's nuclear sites last year?
Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. It was obliterated like nobody's ever seen before. And in June, we obliterated Iran's nuclear capacity.
Of course, that wasn't true. I mean, that was all after last summer, so that was before Trump even started the Iran war itself. But even as Trump in recent months has talked about how to get Iran's quote-unquote nuclear dust, it's highly enriched uranium, he never mentioned Pickaxe Mountain until the past week. According to a source, Israeli intelligence believes Iran moved advanced centrifuges and part of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium to Pickaxe after the 12-day war last June. Okay, just think about the timeline here. If that is true, it raises a massive question. Because if Iran moved nuclear material to Pickaxe after last summer's bombing, why didn't the U.S. and Israel bomb it in the past nearly 5 months of this war? It does not make any sense. And Robert Kelly, a former chief nuclear inspector, who will join me in a moment, says while the intelligence may be attention-grabbing, he believes there's not much to it. So we're going to have much more from him in just a moment. Because the sudden introduction of Pickaxe Mountain as some silver bullet solution coming out of nowhere to easily resolve what is a chaotic war with no clear end goal does raise a lot of questions. And when Trump was asked about the lack of a plan and a strategy, he snapped.
Mr. President, there are no signs that Iran is ready to stop fighting. So what is the plan? Is the plan to just keep bombing until they give up?
There are no signs. Why, do you know something that I don't know?
Well, they continue to attack our allies and kill Americans.
I don't know what the dialogue is behind the scenes, that they want to meet desperately to try and end it because they're getting decimated. You don't get that when you listen to your fake station, but you don't know anything.
His own base, though, is asking the same question. Just listen to what they're saying on Fox News.
He promised to keep us out of endless wars or unsatisfactory wars, and now he's in one, and it's not at all clear how it's going to end.
With the midterm elections a little more than 100 days away, the clock is ticking for President Trump to get out of this war before voters head to the polls.
Trump, so far, though, is not listening to that message.
Do you believe that Iran is trying to impact the midterm elections by threatening the Strait of Hormuz?
They won't have any impact on me.
Kristen Holmes is out front live outside the White House. And Kristen, this Israeli intelligence, right, that we're hearing, that the Israeli intelligence is saying that Iran moved a lot of nuclear material to this Pickaxe Mountain after the bombing last summer, that I guess it would have been done last fall. That's the intelligence that all this focus on Pickaxe Mountain right now appears to be based on. What are you learning about it? I mean, how much weight is Trump putting on this Israeli intelligence?
Well, look, it's clear there's at least some weight, given the fact that this fixation, this kind of focus on Pickaxe Mountain, which, as you noted, we hadn't heard anything about, came about at the same time that the intelligence came about. So this idea that Pickaxe Mountain, as you said, is some kind of silver bullet solution seems to all focus around this Israeli intelligence. And the other part to note here is that it's coming at a time in which we still don't understand what the United States plan is. They seem to be throwing as much as they can at the wall and seeing what sticks. Now, President Trump was asked specifically about this Israeli intelligence. He demurred, and he wasn't the only one who was playing coy when it came to Pickaxe Mountain. Pete Hegseth was asked about it as well. You have to remember, Aaron, there are a number of experts who don't believe the United States or anyone has the capabilities to actually hit these nuclear facilities because they're buried so deep underground. And Hegseth was asked specifically about that. He was coy as well, saying that a lot of this is classified, but then he added, if anyone in the world can reach anything, it's the United States. And all of this is happening. It's the first time Central Command hasn't announced a series of strikes in 10 nights. So we're watching very closely to see what happens in the next couple of hours, Aaron.
So, Robert Kelly, you're a former IAEA weapons inspector, so you know more than anybody about these sites and how Iran uses them and what inspectors found. When Trump is now just sort of out of nowhere talking about Pickaxe Mountain, which, as I said, is the English translation of the Farsi term for the mountain, this intelligence that's coming from Israel. We understand that Israeli intelligence says Iran moved advanced centrifuges and part of its highly enriched uranium stockpile to that site. Now, just, you know the details here, so I'll show everyone the latest satellite images we have of this particular site, Pickaxe. This is from late June. There's large trucks and vehicles near an entrance. But let me just ask you, when you look at this, you know the site. You know it's come up out of nowhere now. It wasn't bombed in this war so far, when presumably if Israeli intelligence is saying that they moved this stuff there last fall, they knew about it before this war started. So there's a lot of questions that don't have answers here. What do you think?
I think the first thing you need to look at is the Israeli intelligence is not intelligence. It's the third of leaks that have been put out for the last 2 weeks that are designed to confuse. So don't mix up this and calling it intelligence. It is something that's put forward to try to mislead us. Pickaxe has been known for years. If you look at Pickaxe, you'll see a lack of things that should be there. It's not connected to the previous enrichment site, which is only a few kilometers away. And it doesn't have the right indications, like it doesn't have enough electricity. It doesn't have a cooling system there. And it has these trucks going in and out, which you wouldn't have if you have a sensitive centrifuge plant in there. But if you want to really see where this comes from, we've been told now for weeks that the U.S. has satellite imagery that would tell us if the stockpile of enriched uranium was being moved. And that stockpile is a couple dozen small cylinders about the size of a fire extinguisher. So we know that they can't move this around because we've been told that. And now suddenly Israel tells us that thousands of centrifuges, which are much, much bigger and would require an awful lot of effort, thousands of centrifuges have been moved and we missed it. Come on, let's look at this and think these people are jerking us around and we're not that stupid.
I mean, so Robert, why do you think, the way you lay this out, why do you think then Trump is entertaining this idea and embracing this as some sort of silver bullet idea?
Honestly, I think the first reason, he's fascinated by the name. He likes names. He likes to call things by names. If it was called Sugarloaf Mountain, it probably wouldn't be so much interest to them. It's a very, very deeply buried facility. You can see that there's a big tunnel going inside, which is not necessary for a centrifuge plant. It looks like a manufacturing operation that is not yet complete, and it doesn't look like an industrial facility that produces things chemically.
Kareem, what do you think the Iranian regime view is of this suddenly coming out now? The Israeli intelligence comes out about this out of nowhere, and suddenly Trump's talking about bombing Pickaxe Mountain. What is the impact of that to the Iranian regime?
I don't think it really impacts their conduct or their calculations in this war. Right now, the focus should be on restoring the Strait of Hormuz, preventing Iran's proxy, the Houthis, from blocking the Bab al-Mandeb, which is another key energy corridor, the focus should be on protecting U.S. bases in the region and protecting our allies. And going after Pickaxe Mountain is not addressing any of those challenges.
General Marks, Iran has been hitting U.S. bases. They are threatening to expand this war more broadly if something like Pickaxe is brought into the equation. We now know at least 18 Americans have been killed or missing that are soldiers in this war, troops in this war, 100 injured in the past 2 weeks. And I wanted to show everyone in that context, General, something Trump posted on social media today. He posted the dead in multiple wars. Afghanistan war, 20 years, 2,000 dead. And he goes on, war by war, Iraq, Vietnam, Korean, Venezuela, and then he ends with Iran military conflict, 4 months, 18 dead. His entire point is, look at how this hasn't gone that long, and look at there haven't been that many people who died. Your reaction?
Yeah, it's quite frustrating to read that. Look, my heartfelt condolences go out to those families that lost their young men and women over the course of this engagement, as we've lost others in the past. And I've got very personal scar tissue with all of that. You don't measure success of any engagement based on the number of KIA. What the president did is inexcusable. There's no causality between what he is doing with this tweet and what we're trying to achieve, again, which remains somewhat of a mystery.
And what about the fact that he won't call it a war? He called the Venezuela situation a war, even though it was one day. He refused to call the Iran war a war.
Yeah, I can't respond to that, Aaron, and I know that's really more rhetorical than anything else. I don't get it. This is not what you want the President of the United States to do. You want him to embrace the effort that was put forward, convince the American people that this is the right thing to do, and describe it, and realize that we've got a coalition of partners that are going to help and continue to help and not diminish what they're trying to put forward. Let's pressure test what everybody brings to the table. That's what the commander-in-chief is supposed to do, and I'm seeing that. I have not seen that to date. That's the problem.
Just moments ago, CENTCOM announcing day 11 of U.S. airstrikes on Iran. And today, the country's top defense official was asked to explain how the military, he said, was, quote, destroyed and made combat ineffective just days into the fighting. That was more than 4 months ago, is still a deadly threat right now. Now, keeping them honest, whatever you might make of the senator's questions or the secretary's answers, if all of the administration's war aims had been achieved already, the war would be over. And it's not. The missile strike on Americans in Jordan made that tragically clear. And it seems the effort to disable Iran's nuclear program also goes on, at least according to the president. Listen to what he said today about the possibility of striking the suspected nuclear site inside Pickaxe Mountain.
We'll be hitting that area probably pretty soon, and there's not a thing they can do about it. Normally I wouldn't say that. If I thought they could do something about it, I would never say that. But we'll be hitting that area pretty soon. And very heavily.
Now, the president has threatened this before, and tonight Iran repeated its warning that a strike on that facility or any other nuclear site would be treated as a major expansion of the conflict. A war the president today suggested was nothing compared to other wars Americans have endured in our history. You can see this in the post right there, the president listing the death tolls, showing the far lower death toll in this war, which is certainly true. But it also comes on a day the Pentagon released the name of a third American killed over the weekend, Sergeant Michael Swinton, who was fatally wounded during the controlled detonation of an Iranian attack drone. Secretary Hegseth did not mention any of this weekend's casualties in his opening remarks. The Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Dan Kane, did at the outset of his remarks. Secretary Hegseth did, however, give testimony casting doubt on what we've heard from the president repeatedly, the suggestion that Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz and attacking its neighbors was somehow unforeseeable. When we left you last night, a tanker was burning off the coast of Oman, and shipping through the Gulf was down to a trickle. That remains so tonight. Let's go now to our senior White House correspondent, Kristen Holmes. Kristen, the president says he's going to attack Pickaxe Mountain. He says that will happen likely soon. Number one, he has said that before, so is it the urgency real this time, and is it clear what the plan is beyond that?
I mean, Jen, we hadn't even heard about Pickaxe Mountain until a week and a half ago, and now it seems to be the center of President Trump's fixation. Now, that is likely because of the intelligence that Israel has, that Iran had moved some of those centrifuges as well as some of the highly enriched uranium to that location, which is deep under the ground. But President Trump has now been saying that for a week and a half. We just saw an announcement from U.S. Central Command that they've begun their 11th night of strikes. Unclear if this would be a night that they might actually strike Pickaxe Mountain. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of experts out there who don't actually believe that there are capabilities to go that deep underground to hit that nuclear facility. And Pete Hegseth was asked specifically about this. He was incredibly coy. He said a lot of what the capabilities are for the U.S. are classified, but if anybody in the world can reach anything, it's the United States. All of this to say, it is unclear what the plan moving forward was. President Trump was asked that today during a meeting in the Oval Office. He got testy with a reporter saying, "Oh, do you know something that I don't know?" And the reporter really just laid out what we've seen. The idea that Iran has not stopped fighting. Now, the idea that after saying that there was a ceasefire, after saying that we were close, after saying that the United States had essentially demolished the entire military, they were still fighting. And the United States was still at war with Iran. And as you know better than anyone, this war is not something that these Republicans or President Trump want to be dealing with at this time. But yet still, it seems unclear what the plan is moving ahead.
And the Truth Social post we showed at the top, where the president lists the historical numbers of war fatalities. For him to do that would suggest he's sensitive or defensive about this to some degree. Obviously, there's been some polling out recently. 2/3 of Americans don't think this is a war worth fighting. What are the conversations inside the White House? Is it they think the president needs to explain this better? Are they sensitive to the politics? What is it?
They understand that this is a huge issue. It's not just the polling, it's also the American deaths. We are now seeing more Americans dying in the last weekend than we had seen since the beginning of this war. You're looking at 4 soldiers. President Trump will attend that dignified transfer. He is angry about the deaths, and this is something that he cannot seem to shake, to get away from. And you're right, we don't have any details yet exactly of what happened leading to at least some of these soldiers' death. And so the conversations inside the White House, from my conversations with these U.S. officials, is how do we get out of this, or how do we at least press the pause button on this for long enough to be able to start messaging other things, to be able to focus on the economy, to be able to walk away from this war in Iran. And to be very clear, having 4 people die in a weekend, U.S. soldiers, the most, again, since the beginning of this war, is not getting the United States further away from this war in Iran. It's actually bringing them further in.
Kristen Holmes at the White House, thank you. And before I get to our next guest, I just want to ask the White House, the control room, if you could put that picture up again of the 4 service men and women who will come home tomorrow on quite a somber day. Whatever your views on this war, take time the next 24 hours to remember these heroes.
All right, we're also watching a new war front emerge in the Middle East conflict. New video shows smoke rising from an oil facility in Saudi Arabia after Iran-backed Houthis said they targeted the site. The attack comes a day after Saudi Arabia launched strikes in retaliation for the rebel group's attack on a Saudi vessel in the Red Sea. That clash happening during a rare apparent pause in fighting between the U.S. and Iran for the first time after 13 consecutive days of U.S. strikes. CNN's Nick Robertson is joining us right now. Nick, what more can you tell us about these strikes in Saudi Arabia and how that may impact the U.S. war with Iran?
Sure. Look, if these strikes continue, the Houthis striking Saudi shipping, the Saudis responding with strikes against the Houthis, and there have been a couple of those, one overnight, one earlier on today, and the Houthis then firing back at Saudi infrastructure, that really is going to potentially drive up the price of oil, because it will stop Saudi oil getting out, or make it much harder for Saudi oil to get out of the Red Sea through the Bab al-Mandab Straits. 6 or 7% of the world's oil comes out that way. Most of it goes to Asia. So what we've seen today is the Houthis saying that they targeted the main port city of Jazan. That is basically the biggest city that's close to where the Houthis are inside Yemen. So close they can hit it pretty readily. They say they targeted that. They say they targeted Yanbu, which is also a very important Saudi oil facility, but much further up the coast. Saudi alert system went off in Yanbu, but no reports of impact. But in Jazan, There's a refinery there. There's been sights of big clouds of smoke coming up from there. That is a very important city for the Saudis, Jazan. So at the moment, that part of the conflict in the Middle East is set to potentially expand and get worse, and to the point that the UN Secretary General today said that he was very alarmed by the situation there.
And then, Nick, what is President Trump and perhaps the Iranian leadership saying about possibly resuming any talks?
Yeah, there's been a sort of a backwards and forwards. Yes, we're ready for talks. No, we're not. They don't want it. They do want it. Yes, we do. But I think if we try to read what's happening on the ground rather than what people are saying, which is indicative, but what's happening on the ground is a sort of ground reality, if you will. So last night, there were no strikes. Then just in the last hour or so, the Qataris have told their shipping that they can go back to normal safety procedures, of course, but they can go back to normal Sunday. It seems to indicate that the Qataris sort of have a level of confidence in what happened last night. Clearly, this is Saturday. They're waiting to see before the shipping goes back to normal Sunday. But they seem to be indicating that if there is again tonight, no exchange of missiles between the United States and Iran, that might be indicative that a sort of ceasefire, no one's calling it that, but a sort of ceasefire is coming into play. Last night was quiet. That was exceptional. Nobody really spoke about that much. Indications are clearly the White House didn't want to escalate the situation, and clearly the Iranians didn't either. Is that going to hold through tonight? I think in diplomatic circles, those who are watching and are involved closely, they're really hoping tonight will be quiet, and we might be, caveat might be, entering a new phase.
All right, fascinating. Nick Robertson, thank you so much. All right, let's continue this conversation now. With me is Aaron David Miller. He is a former State Department Middle East negotiator and is now senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Great to see you as always. So President Trump says he is weighing launching even bigger strikes on Iran. Iran says, I'm quoting now, it will not submit to American bullies. So what's your assessment here?
I mean, I think that's where we are, Fred. I mean, escalation, epic fury, 40 days of intense strikes, probably the largest deployment of American military power since the Second Iraq War, has not moved the Iranians, has not changed their calculations. And the administration, I think, for a while now has been in a box. The options are not good. Escalation, even severe escalation, is not going to bring the Iranians to the table, at least certainly not quickly. Extrication, simply walking away, is impossible, it seems to me, for this president, or probably for American national interests, which would leave the Straits a sort of ATM machine, and the Iranians want to make good on that as a cash cow. And then there's the prospects of negotiation. We could see resumption of talks, Fred, but the question is not just getting back to the table. The question is, what are they going to do at the table? And that I think is tough. Both sides believe time's on their side. Both sides believe they have the power to escalate. And both sides appear to believe that they can manage and tolerate the pain that's been inflicted. So unless that calculation changes, even if you got back to the table, you're not going to have a serious negotiation.
And then while that's happening or not happening, now you've got Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in Yemen exchanging attacks. So how much does this kind of stir the pot in this region?
I think it represents an expansion, right? I mean, I think Nick said 5-6% of global oil supply comes through Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea. Remember, this is an old story by now. The Houthis opened up in the wake of October 7 in an effort to support Palestinians in Gaza and to burnish their own credentials in Yemen. They literally almost shut down Red Sea trade. It's now, I think, 45 to 50%, forcing shippers and exporters to go around the Horn of Africa. That increases, complicates supply chains. If the Houthis decide to go after ports, Yanbo has already been attacked. The Saudis are exporting anywhere from 3 to 4 million barrels a day through Yanbo into the Red Sea. If that's what they do, then it seems to me price of oil, Brent crude, is going to go up. And there's really no end in sight here. Again, I think a rational outcome here is to have both Iran and the U.S. get back to the table. then the question becomes, can you find a balance of interest on the one issue that seems to be the hardest right now to resolve, and that is what happens to the Straits of Hormuz. Is it free and unfettered like it was February 27, 28, or are the Iranians going to impose new conditions? And I don't know whether the U.S. and Iranian interests right now can be reconciled.
Kind of news involving Saudi Arabia. The U.S. signing a deal with that country to develop its domestic nuclear power program. After it was signed, Trump said normalized relations with Israel would be a condition of the agreement. What do you see happening here?
Fred, again, I'll say it. You can interpret it as a partisan comment. I worked for Democrats and Republicans, and I voted for Democrats and Republicans. What I saw play out in the last 48 hours is sort of a scene out of a Marx Brothers movie. A 3-month negotiation, even longer, with the Department of Energy led by Chris Wright and the Saudis come to a very detailed, haven't seen the text, but a very detailed understanding on any number of issues. And then the president decides, either because he wasn't briefed, it's hard to imagine that he wasn't aware of the issue of Israeli-Saudi normalization. Right now, he basically has undermined the very agreement he wanted to reach. And frankly, it put me down in the not altogether unhappy quality side of this, because there is no compelling reason, according to this agreement, that the Saudis should be able to enrich uranium, even under American auspices, and control their own fuel cycle. We're at war with a country who is essentially violating the International Atomic Energy Agency restrictions on the issue of enrichment. We do not need to lay the groundwork for another latent nuclear weapon state in the Middle East.
All right, more now on the war with Iran and a new front emerging in the region. New video shows smoke rising from an oil facility in Saudi Arabia after Iran-backed Houthis said they targeted the site. The attack comes a day after Saudi forces launched strikes in retaliation for the rebel group's attack on a Saudi vessel in the Red Sea. That clash happening during a rare apparent pause in fighting between the U.S. and Iran after 13 consecutive nights of attacks on Iran. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now from the White House. Betsy, is the administration saying anything about this apparent pause in attacks on Iran, or possible talks even, potentially with Tehran?
Right, Frederica. After 13 consecutive nights of strikes on Iran, a relatively quiet night last night, and no reports of attacks between the U.S. and Iran. Now, this comes after U.S. intelligence agencies had recently assessed that these types of sort of limited strikes that the U.S. had been carrying out against Iran were unlikely to shift Iran's negotiating position. President Trump says that, in his view, Iran isn't ready to make a deal yet. And there were some notable comments from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt to the Wall Street Journal earlier this week. She said that the U.S. will continue to hit Iran until they come to the table in what President Trump deems a meaningful way. So we are waiting to see now whether that is indeed the case here. But President Trump offering some insight into his mindset yesterday. Listen.
Look, we're talking to them right now. I think they're getting more and more serious as the days go by, for maybe the obvious reason. But we are talking to them right now. Look, there are two ways. I consider that the smarter way, but the other is probably the easier way, doing what we're doing. And we can take that to a much higher level if we want to. We're prepared to do that, as you know. We're locked and loaded.
Now, as we are trying to ascertain what to make of this pause in strikes, a senior U.S. official tells me that President Trump has always been clear that his preference is diplomacy, but he has shown Iran what will happen if they fail to come to the table in a serious way, Frederica.
Okay, and Betsy, the Pentagon still hasn't updated the website that tracks casualties of war. What more are you learning?
Well, at issue here is a website called the Defense Casualty Analysis System that tracks those casualties during a conflict. And the New York Times first noticed this, and they got conflicting answers as to why that had been changed from 18 deaths to 14 deaths this week. 3 military officials had told them that there had been some sensitive discussions about whether to include those 4 fallen U.S. service members who died last weekend in the count, because that had come after President Trump signed that ceasefire deal that ultimately, as we know, had fallen apart. But a Pentagon spokesperson saying in a statement that this was a temporary data disruption that would be resolved. Of course, that was on Thursday. It is now Saturday. I checked just moments before I came on the air. The count is still 14.
All right, we're following new developments in the Middle East, where Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen say they attacked an oil facility in Saudi Arabia. The two sides have exchanged multiple strikes in recent days, raising concerns that a new front has opened up in the war. With us now is Brett Bruen. He is a former National Security Council and State Department official in the Obama White House, and he's now CEO of a public affairs company, Global Situation Room. Great to see you.
Good to be with you, Fred.
So are these strikes between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis now creating among the greatest risks for regional escalation of this conflict?
Yeah, Fred, the really interesting dynamic here is throughout the first 5 months of the war, Trump essentially viewed this as, he and Netanyahu versus the regime in Tehran. And yet what is starting to unfold is that there are considerable costs, consequences for other countries. And, if I'm sitting in Saudi Arabia, my frustration level is reaching a peak point. I think it's part of the reason, quite frankly, that supposed nuclear enrichment deal was reached earlier the week, and then Trump tried to change the terms of it. Trump and, quite frankly, American taxpayers are going to be on the hook for a lot of both the reconstruction of the region, as well as just, obviously this thing continues to spiral out of control, and we'll have to see where it goes.
And now, for the first time in about 2 weeks, there were no reported strikes between the U.S. and Iran overnight. Could a pause in fighting be an opening for diplomacy right now, or is this a more ominous sign in your view?
It could be. And look, sometimes in these diplomatic negotiations, you want, as a sign of good faith, to say, we will pause for a moment. And that ensures that negotiators in Tehran can gain some level of confidence, perhaps get a deal across the line. But Fred, we've already seen a deal cross the line, and it didn't hold. And I think that has been the real challenge for Trump, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, is how do I get something that is not just strong, but sustainable? And at this moment, and Trump last night was saying, I want all of my demands met. And that just isn't a realistic starting point. And he's obviously been a very mercurial figure, often changing terms, including, as I mentioned, with a deal that he struck with the Saudis.
President Trump, he was asked last night, if an exit strategy with Iran is afoot. Take a listen to what he said.
There's a military exit where we just keep going just the way we are, and we can even make it a heavier dose, and it's knocking out everything they have. Or there's a smarter strategy, and that's you make a deal, and they want to make a deal. I just don't think they're ready yet.
So what do you think? Is it Iran isn't ready, or as some Iranian leadership said recently, that it will not be bullied by the U.S.? So what is happening here?
Well, let me interpret what Trump was saying. He essentially is implying that the U.S. will just continue to bludgeon Iran. And we've seen this show just recently in the case of Gaza. I do not think that the United States of America wants to be engaged in a conflict in which we are attacking not just civilian infrastructure, as already happened in the last couple of weeks, but civilians. And Fred, it is important that we level set with what Trump is threatening here. You cannot simply bomb your way to a negotiated deal. And that is where I think Americans, and certainly those in Congress, need to start speaking up and reminding that, one, we have laws, and those laws, including in war, have to be followed. But also we have values and morals. And at the end of the day, this is just going to generate more support for Tehran amongst other countries, amongst other groups. And that's worrying from a security standpoint.
Okay. And a couple times in this conversation, you brought up Saudi Arabia, and that deal, the U.S. nuclear deal or arrangement being made with Saudi Arabia. And I'm wondering, is it your feeling that this comes out of an appeasement, so to speak, but at the same time, then the president, the next day after it was revealed publicly, put a condition in place. So do you see this as a viable path for Saudi Arabia and the U.S. in this arrangement of nuclear enrichment, or is there something else going on here?
Well, there is no doubt, Fred, that the regional allies are sending messages to Washington that their economies have been badly hit. There is no Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, their big plan for economic growth, with the vision of missiles on the horizon. And so the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Omanis are frantically calling Washington and saying, you are going to owe us for these. We may not necessarily be seeing that in the public space, but the damage to their economies is so great. And the future prospects, even if we get to a ceasefire or a peace deal, this war has created instability. It's created concern in the Gulf. And that is coming with a considerable...
With what appears to be a pause in U.S. attacks against Iran, the U.S. military did not announce it was launching strikes on Friday. This is after pummeling Iran for 13 straight nights. And we're also not getting any reports of Iranian attacks on U.S. allies in Bahrain, Jordan, or Kuwait overnight. Now, all of this comes after President Trump met with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss a potential escalation of the war. That's according to a source. The president says the U.S. is still actively negotiating with Iran after their ceasefire agreement crumbled earlier this month. But he also suggested U.S. forces could press on with their campaign and even expand it.
There's a military exit where we just keep going just the way we are, and we can even make it a heavier dose, and it's knocking out everything they have. Or there's a smarter strategy, and that's you make a deal, and they want to make a deal. I just don't think they're ready yet.
I want to bring in now Leila Gargazo. She is joining us live from London. So we're hearing from our reporters in the White House, Leila, that President Trump is weighing the possibility of a massive attack. I mean, what could that mean after nearly 2 weeks of punishing airstrikes?
Yeah, so it could mean a range of things. He's said over the last 2 weeks that he could hit civilian infrastructure like bridges or desalination plants. He's also toyed with the idea of hitting Mount Kolang, or as people call it, Pickaxe Mountain, which is part of the Natanz facility. So there could be quite a lot of different options here. The U.S. generally over the last 2 weeks has been working to degrade Iran's military capability and loosen its control over the Strait of Hormuz. So much of those strikes that we've seen in these 14 days have really been in that stretch along the southern area of Iran, the defensive arch. He could widen that out, go back to hitting places like Tehran and really focusing again on the capital. So there's a lot to work with, I guess, in terms of strike targets. That being said, he's also had conflicting statements where he said that, they could be talking, the Iranians are talking, he's open to the idea of diplomatic negotiations. So it's unclear what next steps he's going to take. Now, a lot of the analysts and experts that I've been speaking to over the last 2 weeks have said that if the U.S. is looking to have Iran capitulate via more airstrikes and an expanded campaign, that's very unlikely to happen. And the Iranians themselves have said that. They've said that if the U.S. escalates, they're going to escalate in kind. They're not going to sit and negotiate, and they're not going to move those red lines around things like their nuclear program, which is what President Trump says he wants curbed. So it's unclear what a actual expansion of the mission for the U.S. is going to really do. It's not going to necessarily bring Iran back to the table. And one of the things to remember here is that Iran has a very high pain threshold when it comes to these strikes and even things like an economic blockade. So they can go quite a long time with this kind of conflict before it really starts changing their behavior. And it's unclear if the U.S. is going to want to commit to a much broader war and campaign. Salma.
Well, so far this morning, Iranian media has not reported any strikes inside the country as the U.S. conflict with Iran continues. Now, CENTCOM also did not report any military action yesterday. That's after the U.S. pounded Iran with strikes for nearly 2 weeks straight. President Trump did say he thinks Iran is getting more serious in talks and try to end the war. Let's discuss with Maryland Congresswoman Sarah Elfreth. Congresswoman, thank you for being with me. These, first night of breaks after 13 consecutive nights of attacks. The president is reportedly considering an escalation in strikes. What do you make of these strikes, and do you think they are persuasive? The president seems to think so.
Oh, well, the president claims to be the best deal maker that I think ever was in the White House or in the world, and we're seeing that that's just not true. We're 150 days into this conflict. We've lost 19 service members. Another 400 have been injured. Secretary Hegseth just told the Congress that he estimates this this war has cost $37 billion in taxpayer money, and there's still no end in sight. The president seems to be warmongering via tweet instead of having a thoughtful strategy here. I don't think he had a goal to begin with when he got us into this war, and he certainly doesn't have any way to get us out of it right now. It's I'm watching it just like you are every single day. There is a new escalation, a new twist to this war, and frankly, the American people are fed up.
Well, the president says that the Iranians are getting more serious about talks. Let me play specifically what the president said from the Oval.
Have you made a decision about the major strikes that you were referring to? Okay. Should we expect to see major strikes?
Look, we're talking to them right now. I think they're getting more and more serious as the days go by, for maybe the obvious reason. But we are talking to them right now. Look, there are two ways. I consider that the smarter way, but the other is probably the easier way, doing what we're doing. And we can take that to a much higher level if we want to. We're prepared to do that, as you know. We're locked and loaded.
Locked and loaded, and they're getting more serious. What do you believe is the viability of talks at this point? I mean, there was the ceasefire, the memorandum of understanding that was violated or kind of fell apart within days. What about now?
Honestly, I don't think the president knows how to get out of this, and he's just talking out of both sides of his mouth. To your point, he claimed we had a ceasefire. He was the one who violated it. There is no strategy. There is no plan. I didn't feel like there was a strategy to begin with when we got into this war. We don't know where we are in the process of the war. Congress and my committee, the Armed Services Committee, has not been given an exit strategy. Again, we just see, like you do every single day in the news, more service members in harm's way, more taxpayer money being spent with no end in sight, and just a continued escalation of this conflict for the entire region. And it's not just the U.S. versus Iran at this point. You're seeing Iran bombing other folks in the region, and the escalation of this should be scary to every single American watching it at home, just like we are. Now, the Congress has passed, you probably saw, 2 war powers resolutions. We had 4 Republicans join us, recognizing that we need to reassert our constitutional authority when it comes to declaring war, providing a check on the president. He seems to not care or think that they are at all relevant to his actions here, but the American people are pretty loud and clear that this needs to end. And I'm not sure who he is listening to, certainly not the people, Congress, or even his advisors.
The president, after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that Russia and China are enabling Iran, said that he doesn't believe that Xi and Putin are arming Iran. Here's what he said.
I will tell you that President Xi said he will not partake, and President Putin said the same thing. I think, I trust them. I don't think they'd want to have me disappointed.
He doesn't think they want to have him disappointed. What do you think about the degree to which, and there may be a little daylight between what we heard from Hegseth and what the president said intentionally, but how China and Russia are involved with Iran in this war?
It's my understanding that China has helped the Iranians at least with targeting of U.S. assets, which, maybe is not arming Iran, but it's certainly enabling and helping to put U.S. service members in harm's way. So the president might believe that he is a friend in China here. I don't believe that's true. And again, he has not come to the Congress to justify any of this war. He's not come to, has not come to the American people to justify this war. I don't know what he believes, but he's not listening to, I think, the smarter people on this issue, and it's only putting Americans in harm's way.
I got a wrap for the control room, but I want to ask you one more about what we've been reporting this morning about the uncorrected number of deaths from the Department of Defense. This morning, it's at 14, despite the 4 service members killed last weekend, that the number should be at 18. Some injuries have been removed as well. The Department of Defense says it's a data disruption. What do you say about this change in the number of deaths attributed to this war?
I think it's an odd time to have a data disruption. I think since the president has re-escalated things and we've lost more service members and we've lost more, more service members have been injured, he owes the American people transparency and accountability. And the fact that the Department of Defense can't keep its website up to date, it's obfuscation at the very least, but it is more of a trend of this president obfuscating what is happening in this region and frankly covering it up because he knows that it is a deeply, deeply unpopular war with the American people.
What are you seeing? Saudi striking Houthis in Yemen. What does this mean for the war?
Yeah, I mean, this marks quite an interesting escalation here, Alex, because I'm just looking at the Saudi Civil Defense ex-posts, and they basically had put out another announcement and warning for the Yanbu Governorate. And Yanbu Port is super important because it's this release valve for the east-west pipeline carrying crucial oil that goes through the Bab al-Mandab Strait. And now they say the threat has been eliminated. A little earlier this morning, about an hour ago, they said there was a threat in Jazan, which is also very important because it has a lot of downstream oil products that are created there. That threat, again, eliminated. But just to your point around these vessels that have been struck in the Red Sea. Look, the Houthis had put up this blockade of any vessel that is related to Saudi Arabia, saying that they will not be able to cross the Bab al-Mandab Strait. This is now the 3rd vessel that was struck, according to the reports that we've been reading. And then the Saudi-led coalition striking Hodeidah port, specific targets there. The Houthis have responded saying they mark this as an escalation for escalation. Now, keeping in mind, Saudi Arabia and the Houthis had signed a truce in 2022. This would mark the very first time that truce now is being, majorly under threat. So we know that there's sort of war of words that from both sides, generally speaking, from the United States and Iran. But now the Saudi attacks, specifically in Yemen, really mark sort of an interesting point that we're seeing going into this weekend.
Meanwhile, Iran has been targeting the region often. How are leaders there responding?
So, I mean, with, lots of condemnation that we've been seeing and messaging of, we have to see a point of de-escalation. And the last 13 days have been very interesting because you've had 13 consecutive nights of strikes. It seems that CENTCOM has not embarked on any strikes against Iran overnight. So that would mark a significant pause here. But just speaking to what President Trump has been reiterating this week, that they're planning and thinking about striking Iran in a very big way. And Iran consistently saying it's going to be an eye for an eye. That is their doctrine. And Marco Rubio saying, look, it's going to be a head for an eye. We're waiting to see how this transpires. But when I look at some of the strikes specifically, just over the last few days, it's been Kuwait, Jordan, as well as Bahrain that have really been the focal points. But over the last 13 days, and it's included Oman, Qatar as well. We've seen strikes in Syria as well as Iraq. There's been major concern in the region that this could widen, become a larger war where a lot more sort of transpires. The things that are on the table, and a lot of military analysts are talking about this, could we see a ground invasion? President Trump was talking about the Pickaxe Mountain, Kohe Kolang, which is very close to the nuclear facility of Natanz. Is that going to be a target? We've consistently seen targets against some of those port cities in Iran, and the region is just holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. Because if there is more escalation, if there isn't sort of a diplomatic off-ramp, what does this mean for the wider region? And Alex, importantly, what does it mean for the Strait of Hormuz? What does it mean for Bab al-Mandab Strait, where a new front has clearly opened up again? Also, I want to mention that any Saudi ships are actually under a blockade, but some Chinese-owned vessels that have come from Saudi ports have been able to negotiate with the Houthis in terms of transiting. So maritime officials are watching this very closely, but there is a threat. It is worrying, and this is going to affect traffic all around sort of the region. And importantly, it's going to spill over into the global economy.
Welcome. We begin with what appears to be a pause in U.S. attacks against Iran. The U.S. military did not announce it was launching strikes on Friday after pummeling Iran for 13 straight nights. This all comes after President Trump met with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss a potential escalation of the war. That is according to a source. The president says the U.S. is still actively negotiating with Iran after their ceasefire agreement crumbled earlier this month. But he also suggested U.S. forces could press on with their campaign and even expand it. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has unleashed strikes on what it described as Houthi targets in Yemen. The Saudi military says it was a proportionate response after another Saudi ship was attacked by Yemen's Iran-backed Houthis in the Red Sea. Let's bring in CNN's Leila Garagozlu, live from London. It's good to see you. We may finally be seeing a shift around talks, but what's the latest?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a lot of conflicting messaging that we've been hearing over the last nearly 2 weeks, and especially overnight. You know, President Trump has gone back and forth saying, we're open to talks, we are talking, we want to strike harder. So it's very difficult to read the tea leaves in this situation because the president is a bit unpredictable when it comes to this. Now, just last night, he said that the Iranians were actually talking. Take a listen.
And by the way, they are talking to us right now. They'd love to make a deal. I don't think they're ready to. I don't think it's time yet, but I'm willing to listen. But they cannot have a nuclear weapon. We don't want to see Washington, D.C., or any of our cities, or Israel, or frankly, the Middle East, destroyed with a nuclear weapon, because I know the power of nuclear weapons. I see it. I get to see it. We're not going to let that happen.
So the real issue here is that the Iranians have not said that they are talking. They've actually been quite clear that they're open to negotiations, but they're not in the midst of talking. And part of that really comes down to the fact that they're not really seeing an element of trust with the American delegation and President Trump when it comes to any sort of negotiations. They don't believe that they can actually get a deal that leads them to that moment of peace, right? And they don't want a no war, no peace limbo situation once again. That's basically what we saw in that lead up to the MOU. And then, as you know, the MOU was incredibly vague, very difficult to implement. The Iranians don't want that again. Any sort of deal, they say they want to have it be something that achieves lasting peace. Now, the other element that I think is interesting to look at when it comes to President Trump's comments is that he continuously shifts the goals of this war. And this is another thing that the Iranians take issue with. And a number of analysts that I've spoken to over the course of the last few months have said time and time again that that's going to be what makes it very difficult to get some sort of deal or find an off-ramp. Because the goals of the war from the U.S. perspective keep shifting, whether it's Iran's nuclear program or the Strait of Hormuz, it makes it a very difficult situation to negotiate around.
And at the same time as that, how significant is Saudi Arabia's decision to strike the Houthis?
Yeah, so this is quite significant. We've seen a truce in place between the Houthis in Yemen and Saudi Arabia since about 2022, and that was quite a big deal, really drawing down a years-long conflict. Now we're seeing that flare up again, and it really means that we might see another front to this war off the back of the U.S.-Iran, which once again leads to these concerns of an expansion and escalation throughout the broader region. So we're going to have to watch what happens between Saudi and Yemen very, very closely. If we see things really kick off there, again, it's going to have this massive impact on the region and these trade routes like the Bab el-Mandeb and the broader Red Sea.
Pay up. That's what Trump is demanding of Iran as it launches new strikes tonight. In a post Trump just put out, he said, quote, please let this statement serve to represent, until further notice, that from this point forth, any and all damages done to ships, cargo, or anything related thereto will be paid for by Iranian money that the United States has in its possession and controls. These damages may be very substantial, but nevertheless, this is the fair and equitable thing to do. Now, it's worth noting that this is the same man who said he was going to give Iran its money back as part of the MOU, right? That was the whole thing. He was giving them this money back. He actually said this.
It's not our money, it's their money, and we froze it. At a certain point in time,
It's not our money, it's their money. Those are his words. Now, Trump's claim about where the money is going to come comes after he has just leveled another massive threat, telling Axios, quote, I am considering a massive attack, bigger than ever before. I am close to making a decision. We're all set for it. Yeah, well, the rhetoric out there is causing a lot of problems, real world problems for Americans and around the world. I mean, for the first time since May today, on the back of comments like that, oil prices are back above $100 a barrel. And relief, even if Trump ends the war soon, as he said he's going to do for almost 5 months, well, it's not going down anytime soon, even though he's promised it will.
when this is over, oil is going to drop like a rock.
When this war is over, oil is going to drop. When the war is over, gas will fall down at levels that you've never seen before.
The gas will go down. As soon as the war's over, it'll drop like a rock.
Well, here's the thing. You got to look at what the markets are telling you right now. If you look at Brent oil futures, okay, which is you're looking out, traders trade on this a long time in the future. Okay, we're going out here to April 2032. You can see before we get back below $70 a barrel, which is where prices were before the war. And they're obviously expecting the war to end really soon. Okay, that's why you see the drop there. But it doesn't go back to where it was for years. And it's not just the oil market sounding an alarm. The 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, which is really what is used as the benchmark for credit card debt, student loans, mortgages, all of those interest rates are linked to that. It's up to 4.7%. That is the highest level since Trump was inaugurated. So borrowing costs are going up, gas prices are going up. It's real pain. It's tangible. And on Capitol Hill, Trump suffering a bipartisan hit today, Republicans joining Democrats to pass a resolution for the second time to check Trump's war powers. Now, it's essentially symbolic, but the fact that they're willing to put votes on the line is a public rejection of Trump's war. And tonight, his approach here could be pushing the U.S. into a wider war. According to the Wall Street Journal, American medics have now arrived at the key medical center in Germany, which is where U.S. troops injured in Trump's war are being treated. Axios is reporting a B-1 bomber was used to attack Iran for the first time since combat resumed, and the U.S. is planning to send more F-16 and F-35 fighter jets into the region. Now, of course, the surge doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a major, massive attack, as Trump says. Doesn't mean it's inevitable. But when you put all that money and all that material in place, sometimes things have a life of their own, despite what Trump has continued to claim on all of this ever since the war started.
Right from the beginning, we projected 4 to 5 weeks.
The U.S. will be gone or done with the war in 2
I think we're
weeks?
2 or 3 weeks. We were in there for 2 months. And you know what? We're going to have victory very shortly. I thought it would take 4 to 6 weeks, and I was right.
We'll have that over with soon. It'll be over with soon.
It's 5 months and counting. Kristen Holmes is out front live outside the White House. And Kristen, all of this together, when you see what's happening, if you look at data point after data point, right, putting planes in place and medics, and then Trump's rhetoric saying possibly the most massive strike since the war began. What are you hearing about where his head is tonight, and frankly, how quickly he keeps changing his mind?
Well, Aaron, I mean, as you said, it's 5 months and counting, and the end is not anywhere in sight. First of all, you have Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying things like Iran is begging to get to the table, something we've heard from President Trump, too. But then President Trump today saying he doesn't think Iran is ready for a deal, even going further than that, saying they need more of the same. Well, more of the same likely is referring to the fact that we've had 12 consecutive nights of bombings in Iran, but are reporting today that the CIA and the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, have recently assessed that this kind of bombing that the U.S. is doing every single night is unlikely to move Iran's negotiating position. So what exactly is it that President Trump is trying to do? And we've heard this kind of rhetoric from him before. Now, when we've talked to U.S. officials, they have said that Trump has yet to sign off on the most aggressive military action. So is what he's trying to do get Iranians back to the negotiating table? It's really unclear at this point. But as you noted, he is making all of the moves, setting up for a potential escalation in military operation. But what does that do for this war in Iran? What does that do for the American people? I can tell you from every conversation that I have with the White House, with White House officials, U.S. officials, anyone close to President Trump, they do not want to be talking about this war. They do not want to be engaging in this war. They would take a ceasefire now if they could just get a ceasefire, hope for the prices to kind of level or at least go down a little bit, and then they could move on to talking about things like the economy. That's obviously not going to happen if President Trump escalates this. So is he willing to escalate this and potentially even put boots on the ground? We just aren't clear right now what the strategy is, and we're getting nothing from President Trump's orbit as to what he's going to do to break this impasse between Iran and the United States that at this point seems like it's just going to continue.
Yeah. All right, Kristen, thank you very much. And of course, just so much confusion on strategy and also what the end goal even is, what they actually want. Christoph Kettle is here with the New York Times. Seth Jones is also here with me. And I know both of you have so much new information. So Seth, can I just start with you? I know you've been speaking to senior U.S. officials. Are we about to see a massive escalation here, the bigger strikes, bigger action than since the war began?
Well, Aaron, only one person knows the answer to that, and that is President Trump right now. I will tell you what the military has given him is options. They've given him options if he wants to open up the strait. This will be risky. They've given him air options. They've given him air plus naval options, so to put in naval vessels, including potentially destroyers through the strait to bring in tankers and others, and then air plus naval plus ground options. So the president does have options if he wants to forcibly open up the strait.
The Iran war gets a second front. The president says he's weighing a massive new attack. As U.S. intelligence assesses, the current bombing campaign is unlikely to get Iran to give in. John King here, in for Anderson. There's all that tonight, and for the 13th straight evening, more U.S. airstrikes. No sign yet they differ greatly from the first 12, but earlier today, the president telling Axios, quote, "I am considering a massive attack, bigger than ever before. I'm close to making a decision. We are all set for it." The president also claims that Tehran wants to negotiate, but in his words, quote, "They haven't received enough pain yet." Here's how he put it a short time later.
We're doing very well against the Islamic Republic of Iran. We're doing extremely well. They would like to do something, but I say they're not ready yet. They need more of the same. They're not ready yet.
Clearly, though, the president's remarks to Axios suggest that more of the same, as he put it, has not been enough. And brand new CNN reporting certainly backs that up. Two sources familiar with the matter telling us both the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency have recently assessed that the current bombing campaign is unlikely to force Iran and its leadership to shift its negotiating position. That said, the talk is certainly getting tougher. Here's Secretary of State Rubio.
Do you rule out striking civilian infrastructure?
I think I saw, guys, I saw Arachi, their foreign minister, who the other day say or something about their policies, an eye for an eye. The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be.
And late today, the president added a wrinkle to that, posting, quote, "Any and all damages done to ships, cargo, or anything related thereto will be paid for by Iranian money that the United States has in its possession and controls." It's unclear whether those tougher words will budge Tehran, which gained leverage of its own last night in the form of a second front, namely in the Bab al-Mandeb. That's the choke point. You see it on the map at the mouth of the Red Sea. You see traffic flowing through it now, but last night, Iranian-backed Houthi fighters hit 2 Saudi oil tankers attempting passage, and that in turn, predictable I guess, sent oil prices surging back above the $100 a barrel mark. Gas prices rising as well today. You see it there hitting $4.09 a gallon, up 15 cents from just a week ago. And on Capitol Hill, a House and a Senate split on whether to try to limit the war. House Democrats, joined by 4 Republicans, passed a non-binding war powers resolution. Senate Republicans, joined by Democrat John Fetterman, blocked similar legislation. We begin tonight with our CNN senior White House correspondent, Kristen Holmes. Kristen, I want to start. There's been a revision at the Pentagon, the website, about the fatalities. Can you explain that?
Well, we're still learning more details here. So on Wednesday, the Pentagon had reported these casualties on the website and said what we have been reporting and know to be true, that there were 18 American service members who have been killed since the start of the war. But by Thursday, the Department of Defense had changed that number to 14, so from 18 to 14. Now, according to the New York Times, one of the reasons behind the change was because the administration was not looking at these 4 service members as being part of the conflict. Again, this is from the New York Times reporting, because their deaths occurred after President Trump had announced this ceasefire. But on the other side, we have heard, and again, this has also only been a response to the New York Times. We have reached out on our own, but have not heard from the acting press secretary, who attributed the change instead to temporary data disruptions on the website and suggested that they would be quickly fixed. Now, of course, we're going to monitor to see how quickly they are fixed. And John, I do want to note here, we have been keeping our own tally, and 18 is the number that we have been citing regularly since this last weekend after the passing of those 4 additional service members. So it is unclear why this change happened, but of course we are trying to get to the bottom of it.
Well, let's get to the president's strategy here. Number one, tougher words, a massive strike. We have the will to do it. We have the material to do it. And then the tough words from the president talking about if there's any damage to ships or cargoes paid for out of the Iranian funds that the United States has in escrow. We've heard a lot from the president in the last 4.5 months, and sometimes you get the follow through and sometimes you don't. Connect those and tell us what's the big shift, if one, in White House strategy.
Right now, there is no apparent White House strategy. You had Secretary Marco Rubio saying that Iran is begging to come to the table. Then you have President Trump today saying they're not ready to make a deal. They're not ready to come to the table. Instead, they need more of the same. Well, at the same time, U.S. intelligence is saying in their recent assessments that this more of the same, this bombing every night, is not going to change the Iranian stance on negotiations, or is unlikely to do so. So what is the president going to do? Well, we know and we have reported over and over and over again, the president has been looking for some kind of diplomatic off-ramp. It is just seeming less and less likely. So now there is a decision to make. How far does the president want to go? There is a contingency of people around him, particularly in the political space, who say that if the President Trump goes any further than this, if he talks about putting boots on the ground or does some kind of explosive military action, there is a chance he is completely giving away the midterms here. This is looming over everything that he is doing politically. There's also still the chance that President Trump tries to take this in a different direction, but it's really unclear because the options are so limited, John. We are looking at more strikes, more of the same. Doesn't seem to be moving the needle. So what will move the needle? We still don't know, and we don't know what President Trump is willing to do, but U.S. officials have continued to tell us that he has not signed off on the most aggressive military action yet, meaning likely he is still looking for any kind of off-ramp here.
Kristen Holmes at the White House. Thank you so much. Let's continue the conversation now. Joining me, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Dana Stroll, and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel, if my memory is correct, 25, 26 years in Air Force intelligence. When the DIA and the Defense Department says the current bombing campaign is unlikely to bring the Iranians to the table in a way that is conducive to a deal, and you have the president saying he's ready to up the ante here, what happens next?
Yeah, John, great question. And yeah, after 26 years of experience in Air Force intelligence, this is a bit of an unusual area. But when it comes to the target set that you have in question here, what you're really looking at is the realization that the things that they've done so far in terms of striking targets in Iran while causing a lot of damage have not really changed Iran's war aims or the trajectory of Iran's military moves. And, you know, they talk about decimating the Iranian military. The problem is that Iran basically works with an asymmetric force. And what that means is that they're using means other than conventional military force to achieve their goals. So what we're seeing is the fact that the Iranians can still maintain control over the Strait of Hormuz. That, for the moment at least, has not changed. We're also seeing that Iran has the capability to launch long-range missiles and drones. That has not changed, and that is really one of the key things. These two areas are areas that should have been altered by a campaign that is really couched on what the other side is doing. The problem is that we're fighting a war that's more conventional. They're fighting a war where they've been able to hide a lot of their weapon systems and then brought them out into the open.
And so, Dana, it brings a pretty profound moment and a profound question. You see all the words from the president, an escalation in his words. You see more U.S. military assets moving into the region, which would give him the capabilities, I gather, to back those words up. Some say, oh, it's just to try to convince the Iranians it's time to talk more seriously. Others say the president wouldn't send them if he's not planning to use them. How do you see it?
Well, we've seen this over and over from the Trump administration. When there's a U.S. military buildup in the region, Trump tends to order those assets to be used. We saw it last year before the 12-day war. It looked like he was using that military buildup to signal to the Iranians he was really serious, threatening that use of force to compel them to come back to the negotiating table and make commitments on their nuclear program. That didn't happen, and a 12-day war started. And the same thing this year. There was another military buildup starting in January all the way through February, at the same time that there was a U.S. negotiating team meeting with the Iranians in Geneva. And before those negotiations played out, the war started. The U.S. started striking Iran together with Israel. So number one, I think the Iranians look at this buildup, and at this point, it's reasonable to expect that once Trump builds up, he's boxed himself in and he's most likely going to escalate. And the challenge here is that we have no articulation from the Trump administration as to what those escalated strikes or that escalated strategy is actually going to deliver in terms of achievable objectives. Is this about opening the Strait of Hormuz? Is it about getting Iranian commitments on the nuclear program? We haven't heard that articulation, and so this looks like a means without an end.
And Colonel, as this plays out, you have a second front, at least at the moment. We saw it yesterday, the Houthis getting involved in attacking tankers in the Red Sea. The theater has been Iran and the areas in the Straits of Hormuz. From a capability standpoint, does the U.S. get spread too thin here? Does the United States need additional assets in any particular way if that stays a persistent two-front effort?
Yeah, John, it depends on exactly what the goals are when it comes to Yemen and the Houthis and the opening the Bab el-Mandeb Strait there. So the question then is, if the idea is to go in and decimate the Houthis, we would need more forces to do that. If it is just to keep things open on a more or less temporary basis, we could probably do it with the forces that are already in the Middle East, but it would be a precarious move because things can change very quickly, and the Houthis could probably come in and close the Bab el-Mandeb again if they wanted to.
News is the New York Times is reporting that Iran rejected a ceasefire proposal from President Trump. According to the Times, it was the Iraqi prime minister who personally carried the offer directly to the Iranians in Tehran. It comes as U.S. forces are bombarding Iranian targets for a 13th straight night, and once again runs counter to the president's description of the war.
We're doing very well against the Islamic Republic of Iran. We're doing extremely well. They would like to do something, but I say they're not ready yet. They need more of the same.
More of the same, which is not the same thing he's been saying repeatedly for months now.
We've won. Let me tell you, we've won. I mean, I view it as very close to over. We are likewise winning big in Iran. We have many ways we can win, but we've already won militarily.
In fact, sources say even the president's own experts have concluded more of the same is unlikely to shift Iran's negotiating position in any significant way. According to two U.S. officials familiar with those intelligence assessments, both the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, recently determined that the kind of bombing campaign will not be enough to bring an end to the war, which has gone on far longer than the president boldly promised when it began.
We projected 4 to 5 weeks, but we have capability to go far longer than that.
Are you thinking this week it will be over?
No,
Are you
but
talking
soon.
about days?
I think soon.
Okay, and with respect
Very
to
soon. Look,
And I don't think it's going to be long.
Can we wrap this war up this week?
Yeah, sure. Good.
Will we?
I don't think so, but it'll be soon. Won't be long.
It would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks to achieve this critical mission.
So we estimate it would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks to achieve our mission. 26 days in, we're really a lot ahead of schedule.
4 to 6 weeks estimated timeline for Operation Epic Fury.
You know, he said 4 to 6 weeks.
Here we are months later, and instead the war appears headed toward yet another escalation, driving oil prices back above $100 a barrel for the first time in 2 months, as President Trump tells our colleague Barack Ravid of Axios that he is, quote, considering a massive attack bigger than ever before. I am close to making a decision. We are all set for it, end quote. All set for the biggest attack yet, but is the U.S. public all set? Polling overwhelmingly shows otherwise, as the Secretary of State laid out an ominous new Trump doctrine.
The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be. I mean, they will pay a very heavy price for the things they're doing. They're already paying a very heavy price.
A head for an eye instead of an eye for an eye. My lead sources are CNN Global Affairs analyst and former Middle East and North Africa coordinator for the National Security Council, Brett McGurk, as well as CNN National Security Analyst, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Beth Sanner. Good to have you both here. So you read the Times story here. The Iraqi leader goes directly to Tehran, delivering a peace proposal, ceasefire proposal from the president. Iran says no. Brett McGurk, does that indicate to you that Iranians, in fact, are in no rush to reach a ceasefire and don't feel this enormous military pressure?
You know, Jim, I come back. I mean, given everything going on, I think we have to keep. We have Americans. We're at war. We have Americans over Iran tonight, men and women in combat.
Dramatic escalation could be right around the corner in Iran. President Trump tells Axios that he's considering a, quote, massive attack against Iran, one bigger than ever before, and he's close to making that decision now. He says Iran wants to negotiate, but Trump doesn't want to make a deal. He says, quote, they haven't received enough pain yet. However, the New York Times is also reporting tonight that Iran has rejected a ceasefire proposal from Trump, one that was presented to them by the Iraqi prime minister. Now, sources tell CNN that U.S. intelligence agencies say the bombing that the U.S. is currently carrying out is unlikely to shift Iran's negotiating position. And according to Marco Rubio, Trump is done with a proportional response.
Do you rule out striking civilian?
I think I saw, you know, guys, I saw Arachi, their foreign minister, who the other day say or something about their policy is an eye for an eye. The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be.
It all comes as the House narrowly voted to limit Trump's war powers in Iran, but a similar measure was rejected in the Senate. And a new Fox News poll shows that Trump's and the party's support is waning. Trump is significantly underwater when it comes to his handling of his job, as well as inflation, the economy, Iran, even immigration. With the midterms just over 3 months away, some are already sounding the alarm.
The truth is there's not much good news for Republicans in this whole poll we did. You know, underwater on the economy, as you showed, underwater on affordability. Those two issues are front and center for sure. And everywhere you look, Republicans are down.
Now, before we open it up to the table here, I want to invite you at home to join the debate. Head to CNN.com/Abby. You can weigh in there. We'll get to some of your comments throughout the show. Congressman Khanna, just for starters, when you hear the president talking tough, as he has been, frankly, for the last several months in this conflict, and then also sending Iran a proposal for a ceasefire that they then summarily reject, what does it tell you about what the strategy is here?
There is no strategy. I'm for results. We just voted to, again, stop the war in Iran this morning in the House. But what has the president achieved? He's driven gas prices up. He's driven food prices up. The enriched uranium is still in Iran. They have a more extreme regime because the sun isn't even saying what Khamenei did, which was we won't develop nuclear weapons. The IRGC is strong.
U.S. strikes on Iran appear to have paused after nearly 2 weeks of nightly attacks. And this comes as CNN has learned that Vice President J.D. Vance and the Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane have both raised concerns about escalating the war. CNN senior national security reporter Zachary Cohn is here with us in the Situation Room. Zach, sources say that General Kane specifically raised concerns about U.S. munitions stockpiles and other potential issues. What more are you learning?
Yeah, Wolf, this was during Friday's White House meeting where President Trump and his top advisors were discussing options to potentially escalate this conflict with Iran. But I'm told that both Vance and Kane laid out some hard truths for the president during this discussion. And Kane in particular raised this concern about the U.S. stockpile of critical munitions, things like air defense systems that not only protect U.S. military installations in the Middle East and around the world, but also are used by key partners, including the Gulf partners that are helping mediate these discussions between Iran and the U.S. And Kane voicing these concerns again, saying that the war with Iran has significantly depleted the U.S. stockpile of these munitions, things like THAAD interceptors, Patriot missiles, and Tomahawks, and said that an even more extended campaign would even further reduce those stockpiles in a way that could impact the U.S.'s ability to wage a future war, especially if it's against somebody like China or Russia. Now, the Trump administration is pushing back on the idea that the U.S. is in any way underprepared for continuing this war with Iran. Take a listen to what UN Ambassador Mike Waltz said when he was asked about the stockpile issue just yesterday.
I want to be crystal clear. The U.S. military, and I've verified this every which way, has everything that it needs to conduct this campaign as effectively as it needs to be. And I have to tell you, the people that are leaking this nonsense